I'm going to move on to. I think it would be remiss if we to us to have this session and not talk about the Brexit preparations. I think you said that there will be adverse consequences for the UK leaving the EU without a deal, and last week compared no deal Brexit preparations with airlines advising passengers what to do if their plane crashes. So what are the biggest adverse consequences for the transport sector if the government's I understand it's their preferred outcome, leaving with a deal, but if that doesn't happen, what are the risks?
So first of all, on adverse consequences, I mean, if you are going through a big change, then an adverse consequence can be as simple as straightforward as you've got to fill in a piece of paper or a form that you would not have previously had to complete. So it is not necessarily catastrophic things, but it is clearly, if you have any friction in anything at all, then that's an adverse consequence, but it's not insurmountable. Secondly, my comparison, I think, was maybe my comment on question time or something, about when you hear a safety announcement, you don't normally then assume that the worst outcome described in that safety announcement is going to be the outcome. What you typically instead do is kind of think, well, that is extremely unlikely, and the more likely thing to happen is I'll arrive without incident. What has been interesting to watch is, as there have been leaks of Yellowhammer, the preparedness papers published, everyone has immediately assumed that the perfectly proper description of and preparation of what could the reasonable worst case scenario be, the equivalent of landing on water in that case, has been everyone's assumption, like, oh, that's what you think is going to happen, which is not what we think is going to happen. The central case would be something much less dramatic than the extreme Yellowhammer worst case scenario. Nonetheless, as I was describing earlier, I really think that getting this right is to do with the level of preparation that you put in. It's the detail, it's the Matterhorn thing again. It's the detail you put in is the thing which creates the outcome. And we have now spent months, I think, over 60 Brexit operations committee, the so-called EXO committees and COBRA, working through every aspect of this, of which a large number, possibly even a majority, have in some way impacted on DFT and our preparedness planning. So Operation Brock is at the heart of that. It's, as you know, the thing which takes over from Operation Stack. Stack would close motorways, and Brock keeps the traffic running in 2 lanes in both directions. And it has a number of other holding points. And what that does is accounts for, if we were in a reasonable worst case scenario, and there were delays of 1.5 to 2.5 days for lorries, and lorries did stack, then we'd end up with 8,500 in the Brock scheme, and but the Brock scheme can take over 11,000, so that would still not fill it up. So a lot of advanced planning. What we want to do is actually get traders and hauliers ready. And things like the pop-ups which have been appearing in service areas throughout the country and in Europe are designed to educate hauliers and have them ask their traders, so they're picking stuff up from, to be ready. And then if they turn up with the right paperwork, there are no delays, in particular on the short straights, the Dover-Calais route in particular. So if that happens, then we should see it flow smoothly. And it's hard to predict precisely, but we are certainly ready for it regardless.
So in terms of, I've been driving along and seen some of those overhead signs saying the paperwork might change on the 1st of November, you need to be aware of it, or
please check,
whatever. What measurement have you done about what impact those interventions have had on the preparedness of companies who drive and travel
So the
abroad?
last set of, the previous set of Yellowhammer preparedness had us saying that as low as 15% of people could turn up ready, but it could be as high as 50%, so it's 15 to 50. And now that's risen to 30 to 60. So I suppose we think the overall impact has been that many more people will now turn up ready with the right paperwork to across the channel. And just to clarify, this is not an issue of traffic coming in. This is not an issue of imports, because we're not imposing new day one restrictions. So things can flow into this country. The problem, it's obviously an issue of export. As a third country, we would be in a position of needing to have the correct paperwork, for example, to export into France, and it's the French who will be stopping it. The issue is that on the short straits, the Dover-Calais, that run, it's a closed loop. So if lorries can't get one way, and they can't get back again, and that's where the problems would occur. We've also modelled all the other ports, of which there are a huge number, actually far more many ports in the country than is generally recognised, hundreds in fact, but of the ones which are useful for transit of goods. We've modelled them all, and again worked with the local resilience forums in each of the areas. There are far fewer delays anticipated in those locations, just the volume of traffic, and they often don't necessarily go, they export to lots of different locations in Europe, so the numbers are just much smaller.
I'm sure you're aware that in the Operation Yellowhammer document, the sort of it said there was a low risk of significant sustained queues at ports outside of Kent, and then the FT suggested that those were played down in the Yellowhammer document because it assumes that tens of thousands of vehicles would be turned away for being non-compliant. Is that true?
Not quite. So, I mean, I don't think anyone can accuse the Yellowhammer documents of sort of pulling its punches. Like we have never attempted to sort of sugarcoat the worst case scenario. It's really important that the local resilience forums know what the reasonable worst case scenarios are, so that they can plan for it. So, it must have been almost impossible to really think that only 15% of hauliers would turn up with the correct paperwork, because then we'd have to be stuck in the queue. It would be enormously inconvenient. That was always a very low end projection, even though that's up to 30 now. That still looks quite low. But we certainly didn't want to give a artificially better picture than that worst case to local resilience forums. We owed it to them so they could do their planning. The specific issue I think that FT article was talking about, I did see it, was that the centre, if you like, DFT, or the Border Delivery Group, doesn't own the local roads and doesn't own the modelling on the local roads. So I think we were asking them to take our worst case assumptions and then overlay their own local traffic management. And there was some discussion, I think, in that article about, does the traffic then just disappear when it's turned away, which of course it doesn't from a local management perspective. So I think that was a sort of, the FT is not a tabloid, but it was a newspaper interpretation of actually what is a process which is involved. For example, last Thursday I was at Portsmouth at the port, which is obviously a non-Kent port, looking at the issue of what happens when lorries get turned back. Do they have enough spaces? How would it work? There are specific issues at that port, because between the port gate, where they go through the check, and the roundabout on the road, there is only space for 13 lorries. However, the local resilience forum have taken all of our Yellowhammer projections, and they have now worked out how they would manage 735 vehicles in the local area in order to be able to check that they have the right paperwork and go through without creating a tailback at that roundabout. So I think that there's been an extraordinary amount of work done on this, and a lot of gratitude to all the local resilience forums who've worked with us on it, which are police.
But in terms of, you spoke earlier about reducing, about the figures where you've gone from, it was maybe in the region of 15 to, I can't remember what the upper figure was.
So it was 15 to 50, now it's 30 to 60.
So where would you need to be? What's your target for where you need to be to avoid the sorts of disruptions that people are potentially worried about?
So as I've discovered, this is a frustratingly difficult thing to answer, as I've discovered, because there's a difference between trader readiness and then what the flow outcomes are, and it doesn't work on a linear basis. The simple answer is it's quite complicated to model. Not only that, what we can't be certain about is the way that the French customs side will treat this. If the French, as they say at Calais, as they've said they'll do, will do the check and wave through. There's simply no issue in it. They also have some hundreds of, I forget the exact number, I think 200 and something, spaces available for lorries that need to complete some paperwork or whatever, even on the French side. So there's not frustratingly, there's not a straightforward answer to your question, where does it need to be before there are no problems. Certainly the numbers we're seeing now indicate no particular problem at any of the other ports. And I mean, I very much hope we see flow at all the ports, including Dover and Eurotunnel. But the planning is in place. If we don't, if I had to best guess, I would imagine some initial issues which are then resolved, I hope, relatively quickly. But without it actually happening and knowing how the French side respond, it is impossible to know for certain.
One of the potential issues which picked up in Yellowhammer is that traffic congestion in the southeast of the Channel ports could lead to fuel shortages. So, given the uncertainty that you've already talked about, what contingency plans are in place?
So I don't. So the one thing I can say is two things that I can say is one, fully expect there to be absolutely no issues with fuel supply at all. The contingency plans are well in place for all of that, and there'll be no issues with medicine either.
What are the contingency plans around fuel supply?
So fuel, I should say, it's not my area of speciality, so I should probably defer and write back to the committee on the fuel side, but EXO, the committee has done a lot of work on that. On the medicine side, because the freight contract has been let by DFT, I am the expert on it, as it were. And on freight, the committee will remember the issues prior to March with what became known as the seaborne issue. The freight contract, a day one decision that I had to make was on letting the new freight contract, which was up to £300 million invitation to tender. I made that in my first day in the office as Secretary of State because I recognised to get it done for the 31st of October. We need to get on with it. It completed last Friday, and we've now got specific contracts in place to deliver 124% of the required medicine, also some usage for DEFRA and for the devolved assemblies. So it's about 3,000 trucks a week, and that contingency is in place. So even if we saw Operation Brock in place, and by the way, traffic still continues to flow, which is probably part of the answer to your fuel question, but I'll get you a more detailed answer using Operation Brock, so it doesn't stop the traffic flow because the contraflow is permanent now. Even if that happens, we still will have those medicines. That is not at risk because this freight contract has been successfully put into place, and like all these things, when things go well, you don't hear about them, but it completed on Friday.
I've got a number of more detailed questions on that, but I'm going to write to you with those.
Yeah, sure.
If that's, I think that would be more helpful.